Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we travel to Georgian London, a city of elegance and excess, where the rich dined beneath crystal chandeliers, while the poor shivered just beyond the glow of their carriages. Behind every polished surface, there was a story, and not all of them were pretty. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story, and write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from different corners of the world. Now, turn down the lights, let the quiet hum of the evening fill your room, and step with me into the glittering world of London's elite, where beauty met hypocrisy and wealth came with a cost. I returned to London in the autumn of 1843, when the new railway had already begun to change the shape of things, and found that the city I had known in my youth existed now only in memory, and in certain streets the modern world had not yet troubled to remake. I walked through Mayfair on an October morning, the air sharp with coal smoke and that peculiar dampness that rises from the Thames even in fair weather, and I looked upon the great houses where I had once dined, danced, and observed the machinery of wealth in its most intricate operation. I'm old now. My hands shake when I hold a pen too long, and the faces I see in drawing rooms belong to the grandchildren of those I once knew. But memory, that strange preservation, has kept intact the world I witnessed between 1700 and 81, when I first arrived in London as a young man of modest fortune and good family, and 1819, when certain events made it prudent for me to withdraw to the countryside. Nearly 4 decades I moved amongst the wealthy of this city. I sat at their tables, I observed their rituals, I saw what the candlelight revealed and what it was designed to conceal. This, then, is what I remember. Not gossip, though there was gossip enough. Not scandal, though scandal was the common currency of every salon. This is simply how they lived, how we lived, for I was among them, though never quite of them, in that ineffable way that separates those born to 20,000 a year from those who must manage on 2. The London I first knew in the reign of George III was a city of profound contrasts that existed side by side, sometimes separated only by a wall, sometimes by nothing more than a curtain. You could stand on a fashionable street in St. James's and smell both lavender water and the contents of the kennels that ran down the centre of the carriageway. You could hear a string quartet through an open window while stepping over what poverty had deposited on the pavement below. The houses themselves told you everything about the order of this world, if you knew how to read them. The great Palladian mansions that lined the squares were designed not merely as dwellings, but as statements rendered in Portland stone. 3 stories above ground, sometimes 4, with servants' quarters tucked beneath the street in basements that received light only through iron gratings set into the pavement. The proportions were everything. The windows diminished in size as they ascended, so that the piano nobile, the principal floor, declared itself through its generous height and its tall sash windows. Here was where life was meant to be seen. Here was where the theatre of wealth was performed. I remember the first time I was invited to dine at a house in Berkeley Square. It was a February evening, cold enough that the link boys carried their torches through air that seemed to crystallize around the flame. I arrived at 5:30 as the invitation had specified, and was admitted through a door painted a fashionable dark green, and fitted with a brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head, polished to such brightness that it caught every flicker of the street lamps. The entrance hall was designed to impress, and it succeeded. Black and white marble laid in a checkerboard pattern, walls painted a pale blue-green that seemed to glow in the light of the candles burning in sconces of gilded bronze. A staircase rose in a graceful curve, its iron balustrade painted white and decorated with gilt, leading up to the reception rooms above. The air was warm from the fires burning throughout the house, and scented with beeswax and something else, a perfume I would come to recognize as the particular smell of wealth, a mixture of pomade, powder, good wine, and that ineffable quality that comes from rooms where money is never mentioned because it is never absent. The footman took my hat and gloves. He was dressed in livery of claret-coloured wool with silver buttons, his hair powdered white, his manner perfectly calibrated between deference and dignity. He led me up the stairs without a word, his shoes making no sound on the carpeted treads. At the first landing, another footman stood motionless beside a door, as much a part of the decoration as the console table with its vase of forced hyacinths. The drawing room where the guests assembled before dinner was perhaps 40 feet in length, its ceiling decorated with plasterwork that depicted classical scenes of surprising delicacy. 3 windows overlook the square, their curtains of crimson silk damask drawn against the winter night. The furniture was arranged in conversational groupings, sofas upholstered in striped satin, chairs with legs carved in the Gothic manner that was then fashionable, small tables bearing nothing more than perhaps a book bound in Morocco leather, or a piece of Chinese porcelain displayed as one might display a jewel. 24 candles burned in a chandelier of cut glass that hung from a ceiling rose, and more candles stood in branches on the chimney-piece and on side tables. The light they gave was beautiful, but insufficient. The corners of the room remained in shadow, and the faces of the guests seemed to float, luminous and strange, in a golden dimness that blurred edges and softened floors. The other guests were already present, perhaps 16 people, the ladies seated, the gentlemen standing in attitudes of elegant relaxation that I would learn required considerable practice to achieve. The conversation was muted, a murmur of voices punctuated by the rustle of silk and the occasional light laugh that was as much a part of the performance as the jewels that caught the candlelight at every throat and wrist. Would you have envied them had you seen them that evening? I think perhaps you would have. They seemed to exist in a realm removed from the ordinary concerns of existence. The ladies were dressed in gowns of sprigged muslin or figured silk, their hair arranged in high, elaborate structures dusted with powder and decorated with ribbons or feathers. The gentlemen wore coats of superfine wool in dark colours, their waistcoats of embroidered satin, their breeches fitting so closely that one understood why a gentleman's valet was considered as necessary as the coat itself. But even then, on that first evening, I noticed things. The lady nearest to me had a cough she attempted to suppress behind her fan, and in the brief moment when the fan lowered, I saw that her face was flushed in a manner that suggested fever rather than rouge. The gentleman beside the fireplace held himself very still in a way that spoke of pain carefully managed. Another guest entered the room with a gait that suggested gout, though his expression revealed nothing but pleasant anticipation of the dinner to come. We descended to the dining room at 6 o'clock, led by our hostess, a woman of perhaps 45 whose dress of silver tissue caught every flicker of the candles, carried by the servants who preceded us down the stairs. The dining room occupied the rear of the house overlooking the garden, though in February at that hour there was nothing to see beyond the reflection of our own candlelit procession in the tall windows. The table was laid with a precision that would have satisfied a military engineer. Plate and porcelain, crystal and silver, arranged in patterns that followed rules as complex as any legal code. I learned later that the mistress of the house had spent an hour that afternoon walking around the table, adjusting the placement of each element, ensuring that the arrangement conveyed the proper degree of magnificence without crossing into vulgarity. The first course arrived in a procession that seemed almost ceremonial. Footmen in their livery moving in perfect synchronization, carrying dishes that steamed and gleamed, a tureen of turtle soup, fillets of sole in cream sauce, a roasted fowl surrounded by forcemeat balls, a haunch of mutton, dishes of vegetables dressed with butter, salads arranged on platters of blue and white china. The food was placed on the table according to a symmetrical pattern, and we served ourselves, or were served by the footmen who stood against the walls, motionless as statues until needed. The soup was rich and complex, flavoured with wine and herbs I could not identify. The fish was delicate, the flesh flaking at the touch of a fork. The mutton was tender in the manner that spoke of careful aging and slow roasting. Each dish was accomplished, each perfectly executed, yet I noticed that many ate sparingly. The lady to my left took only a small portion of fish and ate perhaps half of it. The gentleman opposite me drank more wine than he consumed food. Between the first and second course there was a pause during which the servants cleared the table with the same ceremonial precision with which they had laden it. Fresh plates were brought, fresh glasses, fresh wine. The second course arrived, a saddle of lamb, ducks with orange sauce, a raised pie, asparagus in the French manner, stewed cardoons, almond cream in stemmed glasses, a pyramid of preserved fruits glistening like jewels in the candlelight. The conversation throughout was light, inconsequential, a stream of observations about the opera, the weather, the state of the roads, who had been seen where and wearing what. No one spoke of money, though money was the foundation upon which everything rested. No one mentioned politics except in the most general terms. No one referenced anything that might disturb the carefully maintained atmosphere of ease and refinement. Yet, beneath the surface, I sensed the currents. A gentleman made a comment about Lord X's difficulties with his creditors, delivered with a smile that did not reach his eyes. A lady mentioned that Lady Y had been seen at the theatre with her husband's cousin, and the tone in which she said it conveyed more than the words. Someone spoke of a mutual acquaintance who had retired suddenly to Bath, and the slight pause before the word retired suggested that the retirement had not been voluntary. The dinner concluded after 3 hours with a dessert course of fruits and sweetmeats, nuts and crystallized ginger, small cakes and glasses of sweet wine. The ladies then withdrew, rising in a rustle of silk and leaving behind the scent of perfume and powder. The gentlemen remained for another hour, passing the port and claret, the conversation growing somewhat franker, though never truly frank. They spoke of their estates, of rents and yields, of investments in canals and turnpike trusts, of the price of consols and the state of trade with India. I walked home that night through streets that were very dark, despite the oil lamps that burned at intervals, my way lit by a link boy I had hired for 6pence. The air was cold and damp, and as I walked I passed people sleeping in doorways, huddled under rags, their presence so common that one learned not to see them. The contrast was so sharp it seemed almost deliberately arranged, those dining rooms blazing with light and warmth, these dark streets where the poor made what shelter they could against the February cold. This was London. This was how the wealthy lived. Not in ignorance of poverty, for it was impossible to be ignorant of something so omnipresent, but in a kind of parallel existence where poverty was simply part of the landscape, like the weather, unavoidable, but not requiring any particular response. Over the years that followed, I dined at dozens of such houses. I learned the subtle gradations of wealth and status that determined everything, from the number of courses served to the quality of the wine, to the exact degree of friendliness with which one might be greeted. A dinner of 3 courses marked a family of comfortable fortune. 5 courses suggested wealth. 7 or 9 courses arranged in the French manner with elaborate symmetry indicated the highest echelons of society. But I also learned what happened behind those gleaming doors between the dinner parties. I learned how the great houses functioned, the machinery of servants and systems that made possible that appearance of effortless grace. The servants rose before dawn. In winter, they rose in darkness so complete that the house might have been at the bottom of a well. The kitchen maid was first, tasked with riddling the ashes from yesterday's fires and laying new fires throughout the house. She worked in silence, alone in the sleeping house, her hands black with coal dust, her breath visible in the unheated rooms. By 6 o'clock, the cook was in the kitchen, and the scullery maid was drawing water from the pump in the yard. The housemaids were sweeping the main rooms, careful not to raise dust, wiping down surfaces, emptying chamber pots, carrying away the evidence of the previous day's occupation. The footmen were laying fires in the principal rooms, polishing the silver, decanting wine for the day's use. The lady's maid entered her mistress's chamber at 8 o'clock to open the curtains and bring morning chocolate on a tray of japanned metal. She would have been up since 6 herself, heating water, preparing her mistress's clothes, ensuring that everything required for the day's toilette was in readiness. The mistress of the house might not rise until 10 o'clock or even later. She breakfasted in her chamber on tea and toast, perhaps an egg, certainly nothing substantial, for fashion dictated a slenderness that required constant vigilance. Her morning toilette took 2 hours. The lady's maid dressed her hair, laced her stays, helped her into the layers of shift and petticoat and gown that constituted proper dress. Every detail had to be perfect, the ribbons just so, the tucker properly arranged, the fichu pinned at exactly the right angle. By midday, the mistress might descend to the drawing-room to receive morning callers, or to go out in the carriage for a drive through the park. The afternoon might be occupied with shopping on Bond Street, visits to the dressmaker or milliner, calls upon friends, perhaps the viewing of an exhibition at Somerset House. The master of the house kept different hours. He might spend his morning at a coffee house reading the newspapers and conducting business. He might visit his tailor or his wine merchant. If he was a gambling man, and many were, he might pass the afternoon at White's or Brooks's, where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card or the speed of a horse. Dinner was at 6 or 7 o'clock in the houses of the fashionable. After dinner, there might be a visit to the theatre or opera, a card party, a ball during the season, a gathering at one of the pleasure gardens when the weather was fine. The wealthy did not retire early. I have attended routs that continued until 3 in the morning, the rooms blazing with candles, the air thick with heat and perfume and the smell of wine, the guests moving through the crowded rooms in a kind of elegant, exhausted dance. The servants, meanwhile, could not retire until their employers did. The footman stood through the entire evening, ready to answer a summons, to bring refreshment, to announce a visitor. The lady's maid waited in her mistress's chamber to undress her and prepare her for bed, no matter how late the hour. The kitchen staff cleaned and scoured and prepared for the next day's meals. By the time the last candle was extinguished, it was often past midnight, and in 4 or 5 hours the entire cycle would begin again. I became friendly with a footman named Thomas, who had been in service since he was 12 years old. We sometimes spoke in the area of his employer's house, where he would emerge for a moment's respite during a long evening. He told me that he was allowed one afternoon off each month, and that he sent most of his wages, £18 a year, to his mother in Hampshire. He slept in a room in the attic that he shared with 2 other footmen, a room that was stifling in summer and bitter cold in winter. He had been beaten once by the butler for being slow to answer a bell. He expected to remain in service all his life, and if he was fortunate, he might eventually rise to the position of butler himself and earn perhaps £40 a year. Would you have called it refinement, the life those servants made possible? Or would you have seen it for what it was, the comfort of a few built upon the ceaseless labour of many, dressed in livery and taught to be invisible? The season brought its own particular intensity. From January through June, when Parliament was sitting, the fashionable world compressed itself into London. Every family of consequence maintained a townhouse, and those houses became stages for an elaborate social performance whose purpose was both to display wealth and to secure advantage through the making of advantageous connections and, most critically, advantageous marriages. The marriage market operated with a frankness that might have seemed shocking had it not been so thoroughly normalised. A young woman making her debut was assessed as dispassionately as a horse at Tattersall's. Her fortune, her family, her person, her accomplishments, all were evaluated and discussed. Her value was calculated in pounds per annum, in acres, in connections to titled families. I knew a young woman, I shall call her Miss H., who came to London for her first season in 1794. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant who had made his fortune in the West Indies trade. Her portion was £15,000, a considerable sum. She was handsome in a conventional way, accomplished on the pianoforte, fluent in French, capable of making watercolour sketches of acceptable competence. Her mother had ambitions. The merchant wealth was to be exchanged for aristocratic lineage. Miss H. was dressed in gowns from the most fashionable modiste, displayed at every assembly and ball, paraded through Hyde Park at the fashionable hour. Her mother hinted at her fortune without quite stating it directly. Her father made it known that he would be generous in the marriage settlements. She was courted by several gentlemen, all of them younger sons with no prospects beyond what they could secure through marriage. One in particular seemed promising. The 3rd son of an earl, a lieutenant in a fashionable regiment, possessed of good looks and charming manners. He danced with Miss H. at Almack's. He called upon her at her father's house. He accompanied the family to the opera. The courtship proceeded according to the accepted forms. By May it was understood that an offer would be made. The lawyers were consulted, the settlements were discussed, the wedding was anticipated for autumn. And then, quite suddenly, the gentleman withdrew. No explanation was offered. He simply ceased to call, ceased to appear where Miss H. might be present. The family learned later, through the unavoidable machinery of gossip, that he had instead offered for a young woman whose portion was £5,000 smaller, but whose family was more distinguished, her father being a baronet of ancient lineage, Miss H married eventually, in her third season, to a country gentleman of adequate fortune and no particular distinction. She left London, and I never saw her again. But I remembered her face at that ball at Almack's, flushed with hope and pleasure, and I wondered what she thought in the years that followed when she looked back on that season and understood how she had been valued, and found wanting not in herself but in the degree of lustre her father's trade money could purchase. The marriage market had its male casualties as well. Younger sons, born to titled families but inheriting nothing beyond their name, faced a future of genteel poverty unless they could secure a living through the church, the military, the law, or marriage. I knew several such men. They lived on credit, maintaining an appearance of prosperity through the forbearance of their tailors and landlords, gambling on the possibility that an heiress might be secured before the creditors lost patience. One such man, whom I shall call Captain B, lived in chambers in St. James's Street that were furnished with more elegance than his means could support. He owed money to his tailor, his bootmaker, his wine merchant, his landlord. He attended every event where heiresses might be found. He was charming, well-dressed, possessed of that easy confidence that comes from birth into the upper ranks of society. He courted a series of young women over several seasons, always selecting those whose fortunes were sufficient to pay his debts and provide a comfortable income. But he was competing with other men in similar circumstances, and there were never enough heiresses to satisfy the demand. By the time I knew him, he was approaching 40, his credit exhausted, his prospects dim. I heard later that he had gone abroad to escape his creditors. There was no formal scandal, no public acknowledgement of his ruin. He simply disappeared from London society, and after a year or two, no one spoke of him at all. This was how failure was managed among the wealthy, not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet removal, the unfortunate simply fading from view as though they had never existed. The great houses themselves revealed much about the nature of wealth in Georgian London, if one knew how to read the signs. The public rooms were designed for display, furnished with an attention to fashion and an expenditure of money that announced the owner's status to every visitor. But the private rooms told a different story. I was once invited to stay for several days at a country house belonging to a family of considerable wealth, and during that visit I had occasion to see more of the house than would normally be visible to a guest. The state apartments were magnificent, gilded furniture, silk hangings, painted ceilings, marble chimney pieces. But the family's private sitting room, where they gathered when alone, was almost shabby by comparison. The furniture was old, the upholstery worn, the carpet faded. This was where they actually lived, and they lived with an economy that would have surprised those who saw only the public rooms. The same was true of many great houses. The contrast between public magnificence and private frugality was not hypocrisy precisely, but rather a recognition that wealth was a performance that required constant maintenance. Every dinner party, every ball, every reception was an investment in status. The display was not optional. It was the mechanism by which position was maintained and advantage secured. Yet the cost of maintaining that display was enormous. A house in Mayfair required a staff of at least a dozen servants: butler, cook, housekeeper, lady's maid, footmen, housemaids, kitchen maid, scullery maid, coachman, grooms. Their wages alone amounted to several £100 per year. Then there was the cost of food, wine, candles, coal, laundry, repairs. A single dinner party for 20 guests might cost £20. A ball could cost £50 or more. Families with incomes of £2,000 or £3,000 per year lived in a state of constant financial anxiety, attempting to maintain appearances that their income could barely support. They economised in private so that they could spend lavishly in public. They put off paying tradesmen's bills for months, sometimes years. They borrowed against next year's income to meet this year's expenses. I knew a family who lived in Grosvenor Square in a house that proclaimed their wealth through every detail of its facade and furnishing. The master had inherited an estate that produced perhaps £3,000 per year, which should have been sufficient for a comfortable existence. But he had a wife who was determined to move in the highest circles of society, and that determination required expenditure beyond their means. They entertained, frequently, always lavishly. They kept a box at the opera. They maintained a carriage and 4 horses. Their daughters were dressed by the most expensive modiste in London. They appeared prosperous, even wealthy. In reality, they were drowning in debt. I learned this only by chance through a conversation with a mutual acquaintance who had connections in the city. The master had borrowed from moneylenders at ruinous rates of interest. He had mortgaged the estate. He was being pursued by tradesmen whom he had not paid in years. The collapse came suddenly, as such collapses always did. A creditor lost patience and sued. Other creditors, sensing danger, did the same. Within a month, the house was stripped of its furniture to satisfy the judgments. The family withdrew to the country, to a much smaller house on an estate much reduced. The daughters, who had been prepared for brilliant marriages, instead married country gentlemen of modest fortune. The family name, which had been respectable, became associated with scandal and failure. Yet even then, the surface was maintained. The family was not ostracized. They were not discussed in tones of moral condemnation. Their ruin was simply accepted as one of those unfortunate things that sometimes happened. Other families continued as before, gambling on the possibility that their own creditors would remain patient, that their own fortunes would somehow stretch to meet the demands of their position. This, then, was the reality beneath the gilt and marble, a society living on credit, maintaining appearances through expedients, always one miscalculation away from collapse. The wealthy of Georgian London were not, for the most part, possessed of vast liquid fortunes. Their wealth was in land, in rents, in consoles that paid 3%, in expectations of inheritance. They lived well, but always slightly beyond their means, always borrowing from next year to pay for this year, always hoping that fortune would smile rather than frown. The season demanded particular expenditure. A family bringing a daughter out required new wardrobes not only for the daughter, but for the mother as well. They required subscription to Almack's, that temple of exclusivity where the patronesses ruled with absolute authority and where an invitation was essential for any hope of social success. They required a carriage fine enough to be seen at Hyde Park at 5 o'clock. They required an endless succession of new gowns, for fashion was merciless, and to be seen twice in the same dress was to announce oneself as economizing. I attended Almack's on several occasions, as the guest of members who had secured vouchers for me. The rooms on King Street were not, in themselves, particularly impressive. The assembly rooms were large but plainly decorated, the furniture adequate but not luxurious. What made Almack's important was its exclusivity. To receive a voucher was to be acknowledged as acceptable to the highest ranks of society. To be refused, or worse, to have a voucher revoked, was to be cast into social darkness. The rules were strict and apparently arbitrary. No gentleman could enter wearing pantaloons, only knee breeches were acceptable. No one could enter after 11 o'clock, no matter how exalted their rank. The refreshments were notoriously meagre: weak lemonade, stale cake, tea. Yet people competed desperately for admission, because Almack's was not about pleasure. It was about position, about being seen in the company of those who mattered, about ensuring that one's daughters were visible to the right young men, and that one's sons had access to the right young women. I watched the patronesses on their gilt chairs, observing the crowd with expressions of remote judgment. They were women of impeccable lineage and unquestioned authority. They decided who would enter and who would not. They determined the social fates of families with a nod or a refusal. Their power was absolute within their domain, and their domain was the marriage market that determined the futures of hundreds of young people each season. Would you have called it elegant, that assembly of people in their finest dress, moving through those rooms with studied grace? Or would you have seen it as I came to see it, a marketplace where human beings were commodified, assessed and exchanged, all under the guise of refined entertainment? The diversions of the wealthy were many and varied, and often revealed more about their inner lives than their public personas suggested. Gambling was nearly universal among the men, and not uncommon among the women. At White's and Brooks's, at private card parties in Mayfair drawing rooms, fortunes changed hands with a casualness that masked the genuine ruin that gambling caused. I knew a gentleman, Lord M., who lost £6,000 in a single night playing faro at a house in St James's. £6,000 was the annual income of a prosperous gentleman farmer. Lord M lost it in 5 hours and appeared the next day at Hyde Park as though nothing had occurred. He had the estate income to absorb such losses, though his heir would eventually inherit a property much reduced by his father's passion for cards. Others were not so fortunate. I witnessed at White's one evening a game of whist where a young man lost more than he possessed. I watched his face as the realization came to him that he had ruined himself. He turned white, then red, then white again. His hands trembled as he signed the note acknowledging his debt. He left the club and I never saw him again in London. I heard later that he had taken a post in India, that distant repository for younger sons and failures, that place where the fortunate made fortunes and the unfortunate found what ending they could under an alien sun. The addiction to gambling was spoken of occasionally, but never seriously addressed. It was understood as a weakness of character, but also as something expected, particularly in young men of fortune. The gambling clubs were centres of social life, places where political business was conducted, where useful connections were made. One could not entirely avoid them without withdrawing from society itself. Women gambled as well, though more discreetly and in different venues. Card parties in private homes could see substantial sums change hands. I knew ladies who regularly played for stakes they could not afford to lose. The wife of a gentleman of my acquaintance once lost £800 in an evening, a sum that represented nearly a third of her annual allowance. She paid it by selling jewellery that her husband had given her, and he never knew, or at least never acknowledged knowing. The theatre and opera provided entertainment of a different character, though still serving the social purpose of seeing and being seen. The Italian opera house in the Haymarket was less about the performance on stage than about the performance in the boxes. Families of consequence maintained boxes by subscription, and the boxes were dressed with as much care as the drawing rooms at home. The occupants arrived late, after the performance had begun, and spent much of the evening visiting other boxes, conducting conversations that had nothing to do with the music being performed below. I remember an evening at the opera when Madame Catalani was singing. Her voice was remarkable, capable of feats that seemed to transcend the physical limitations of the human throat, yet the audience paid her only sporadic attention. They were more interested in observing who was present and who was absent, who was wearing what, who was sitting in which box and in whose company. The music was simply a backdrop to the real business of the evening, which was the maintenance and advancement of social position. The theatres in Drury Lane and Covent Garden were somewhat more democratic in their audiences, but the boxes and dress circle were still the preserve of the wealthy. I attended many performances, some excellent, others frankly tedious. What struck me always was the relationship between the audience and the performers. The wealthy in their boxes looked down, quite literally, on the performers and the less fashionable audience in the pit. They conversed during performances, ate oranges through the peels, sometimes shouted comments to the actors. They behaved as though the entertainment existed solely for their pleasure, to be attended to or ignored as their whim dictated. Yet the performers themselves often came from the same world as the audience in the pit, or from worse. They worked for wages that barely sustained them. A minor actress might earn 15 shillings per week, less than a skilled artisan. The leading players earned more, but even they lived precarious existences, subject to the changing fashions of the audience and the whims of theatre managers. I became acquainted with an actress, Miss S., who played supporting roles at Drury Lane. She was the daughter of a provincial actor and had been on the stage since childhood. She told me that she worked 6 days per week, performing 5 or 6 times and rehearsing during the day. She lived in lodgings in a none too respectable area south of the river, sharing rooms with another actress to divide the rent. She was frequently ill from the damp of the theatre and the exhaustion of her schedule. She expected to continue working until her looks faded, and then she did not know what would become of her. She was courted by gentlemen from the boxes, of course. An actress was considered available in ways that a respectable young woman was not. She was offered carte blanche arrangements, proposals that she become the kept mistress of men who could never marry her, but could provide her with better lodgings and an easier life than the stage afforded. Some actresses accepted such arrangements. Miss S. did not, though she told me that the refusal became harder each year as the wear of her profession accumulated. The contrast between her world and the world of the audience in the boxes was profound. They attended the theatre as a diversion, one entertainment among many. For her, it was survival, a grinding labour that consumed her health and youth in exchange for wages that barely sustained existence. Yet when she stepped onto the stage, she smiled and sang and moved with grace, and the audience applauded or did not, as their pleasure dictated. The parks and pleasure gardens provided another venue for the display of wealth and fashion. Hyde Park was the essential stage during the season, particularly at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when fashionable society drove in procession along Rotten Row. This daily parade of carriages was as much a ritual as any church service, and attendance was nearly mandatory for those who wished to maintain their place in society. The carriages themselves were objects of display, as carefully chosen as any garment. A barouche or landau, painted in fashionable colours, lined with silk or leather, drawn by matched horses with glossy coats and elaborate harness, proclaimed the owner's status as clearly as a coat of arms. The occupants were dressed for viewing, ladies in their finest day dresses and most becoming bonnets, gentlemen in perfectly tailored riding clothes if on horseback, or elegant morning dress if in carriages. The procession moved slowly, allowing ample opportunity for observation and greeting. People bowed to acquaintances, cut those they wished to snub, stopped to converse with particular friends. It was an elaborate ballet performed in carriages, and everyone knew the steps. To appear in an unfashionable carriage, or worse, to walk when one should have ridden, was to announce a fall in fortune that might prove difficult to recover from. I walked in Hyde Park one afternoon in May, during the height of the season, and observed this procession from the perspective of one not part of it. The display was impressive, perhaps 100 carriages, all moving at a walking pace, the sun catching on polished brass and patent leather, the colours of the ladies' dresses like flowers in a moving garden. But I noticed also the exclusions, the people walking the paths who stepped aside for the carriages, the servants holding horses' heads, while their employers visited in a carriage, the crossing sweepers clearing the paths of horse droppings to earn a penny from passing gentlemen. The parks were public spaces in theory, but in practice they were carefully policed to maintain the distinction between fashionable society and the rest of London. Vauxhall Gardens and Ranelagh, the pleasure gardens that offered concerts and illuminations and elaborate walks, maintained even stricter control through their admission prices. A season ticket to Ranelagh cost considerable sums, ensuring that only the wealthy and those they chose to bring as guests could enter. I attended Vauxhall one evening in June, when the gardens were illuminated by thousands of lamps hanging from the trees, their light creating a fairy tale atmosphere that seemed to lift the entire scene out of the ordinary world. There were pavilions offering supper, though the food was notoriously poor and overpriced. There were walks through artfully designed landscapes. There was music from an orchestra. It was enchanting in its way, a manufactured paradise where one could stroll and converse and feel oneself removed from the daily realities of London life. Yet even there, the distinctions were maintained. The supper boxes were rented by the season to families of consequence, and one did not presume to enter a box without invitation. The best walks were crowded with fashionable society, while other areas were avoided by the respectable. An invisible map governed every movement, determining where one could walk and with whom one might converse. The Sunday observances revealed another face of wealthy society, one that sat uneasily beside the behaviour of the rest of the week. On Sunday mornings, the same people who had spent Saturday night gambling until dawn, or dancing until the small hours appeared at St George's in Hanover Square, or St James's in Piccadilly, dressed in their finest, occupying pews that were rented by the year and passed down through families like any other property. The services were long, and the sermons often longer, delivered by clergymen who owed their livings to the patronage of the very families they addressed from the pulpit. I listened to sermons denouncing luxury and vanity, delivered to congregations dripping with jewels and dressed in silks that cost more than a labourer earned in 5 years. I heard exhortations to Christian charity from men whose own wealth came from plantations in Jamaica or Bengal, from the labour of people they would never see and whose suffering they need never contemplate. The congregation sang hymns about the equality of all souls before God, and then returned to homes where servants entered through separate doors and ate in separate rooms, where the very architecture proclaimed the hierarchy that governed every interaction. On Monday, The same families who had listened attentively to sermons about humility and grace would be back at their card tables, their dressmakers, their campaigns of social advancement. I do not say this to condemn, though perhaps I do condemn. I say it to record what was, this peculiar ability to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously, to be sincerely religious and utterly worldly, to believe in Christian virtue whilst practicing social Darwinism, to weep at a theatrical performance about virtue, rewarded whilst ignoring actual virtue in actual want on actual streets. The churches themselves were beautiful spaces, filled with monuments to the departed. I used to read the inscriptions on the memorial tablets that covered the walls, fulsome tributes to the departed's piety, charity, wisdom, and every other virtue. Yet I had known some of these departed whilst they lived, and the marble versions bore little resemblance to the flesh and blood reality. The cruel were remembered as kind, the profligate as prudent, the indifferent as charitable. Death, it seemed, granted a general redemption, at least to those who could afford impressive monuments. The truly wealthy maintained family vaults or private chapels where they could be buried, surrounded by ancestors. Even in death the distinctions were preserved. The poor were buried in overcrowded churchyards, where the earth could barely contain the numbers committed to it. The wealthy rested in stone chambers, their names and achievements recorded in Latin on brass plaques, their eternal rest as privileged as their temporal existence had been. I attended many funerals during my years in London. Some were occasions of genuine grief, others of theatrical mourning that observed every convention whilst feeling little. The funeral of a wealthy gentleman was an elaborate affair. Hired mutes in black, a hearse draped in black velvet and pulled by black horses with black plumes, a procession of mourning coaches, a crowd of attendees dressed in deepest mourning that would be worn for months afterward, according to strict rules that governed every aspect of dress. The widow of one such gentleman wore mourning for 2 years, black crepe and bombazine, no ornament except jet jewellery, her handkerchiefs edged with black. Yet I knew that the marriage had been unhappy, the late husband cold and frequently absent. The mourning was real in its performance, if not in its emotion, a duty fulfilled because society demanded it, a costume worn because the alternative was social condemnation. Death was ever present in Georgian London, though the wealthy managed to insulate themselves from its worst aspects. The mortality rate was appalling, particularly among children. Most families lost at least one child to the fevers and fluxes that swept through the city with grim regularity. Even the wealthiest families, with their clean houses and good food and physicians in attendance, could not escape entirely. I knew a family who lost 3 children in a single summer to a wasting condition the physicians could neither diagnose nor treat. The father was a man of great fortune, possessed of multiple estates and an income measured in tens of thousands per year. His wealth could secure the best physicians in London, could provide every comfort, every possible treatment. It could not save his children. They faded over the course of weeks, growing thinner and weaker despite every intervention, until the breath departed and the chambers fell silent. The mother never fully recovered. She was seen occasionally afterward at necessary social events, but she had withdrawn into a grief that no conventional duty could entirely penetrate. Her remaining children were watched with a vigilance born of terror, shielded from every possible contagion, attended by physicians at the first sign of any ailment. Still, she lived in permanent dread, understanding what wealth could not purchase. This too was the reality of Georgian London, death moving through the households of the wealthy, with the same indifference it showed in Seven Dials or St. Giles. The rich died in better surroundings, tended by more skilled physicians, mourned with greater ceremony. But they died nonetheless, and often they died young. The physicians themselves were part of the elaborate machinery of wealth. The most fashionable physicians charged fees that only the wealthy could afford, a guinea or 2 for a visit, more for extended attendance. They arrived in their own carriages dressed as gentlemen, and were received in the drawing room rather than shown to servants' quarters. They maintained an air of supreme confidence even when, as was often the case, they had no idea what was wrong or what to do about it. I observed many medical treatments during those years. I saw bleeding and purging, the standard responses to nearly every ailment. I saw patients weakened by diseases made weaker still by treatments designed to restore their strength. I saw physicians prescribe mercury for conditions that were not helped by mercury, opium for pain that the opium only delayed, quinine for fevers that required rest and time. Some physicians were skilled and careful, others were charlatans with medical degrees, men who had purchased their credentials or obtained them from universities where the standards were lax. But all moved in the same circles, all charged the same fees, all spoke with the same authority. The wealthy believed in them because the alternative was to acknowledge that medicine could do very little for most conditions, and that acknowledgement was too frightening to contemplate. The apothecaries who supplied medicines operated from shops that were themselves small theatres of pharmaceutical display. Glass vessels filled with coloured liquids, drawers labelled in Latin, mortars and pestles, scales and measures. The apothecaries mixed compounds according to the physician's instructions, often using ingredients whose effects were at best uncertain and at worst harmful. I knew a lady who took laudanum daily for nervous complaints. What had begun as an occasional resort became a necessity. She required increasing doses to achieve the same effect, until she was consuming quantities that would have shocked her physician had he known. She became thin and listless, her skin took on a peculiar pallor, her eyes grew dull. But she could not cease taking the laudanum, for the alternative was a suffering she could not contemplate. She died eventually, though not from the condition the laudanum was meant to treat. Addiction to laudanum was common, particularly among women. It was respectable, prescribed by physicians, purchased openly from apothecaries. The slow wasting it caused was attributed to other factors: constitutional weakness, nervous disorders, the vague ailments that were thought particular to women of refined sensibility. No one spoke directly of the addiction, though many must have recognized it. It was simply another reality that existed beneath the surface of respectable life, another secret maintained by polite silence. The men had their own addictions, though different in character. Port and claret consumed in quantities that seem astonishing from this distance. Gentlemen thought nothing of drinking 2 or 3 bottles of wine during an evening. Gout was nearly universal among wealthy men of middle age, a condition caused by exactly the diet that wealth made possible: rich food, heavy wine, little exercise. I knew gentlemen who could barely walk from the pain in their feet and legs, who had to be carried to their carriages, who spent weeks at a time confined to their chambers with feet wrapped in flannel and propped on cushions. They accepted this as a price of their station, even wore it as a badge of prosperity, for gout was understood as a disease of the wealthy, proof that one ate and drank well. The remedies for gout were nearly as painful as the condition itself: bleeding, purging, poultices of bizarre ingredients, dietary restrictions that were inevitably abandoned after a few days. The physician would attend, collect his fee, prescribe the same treatments that had failed last time, and depart in his carriage to attend another patient suffering from the same condition. The coffee houses and clubs where men gathered were thick with tobacco smoke and loud with conversation. I spent many hours in such establishments, observing the rituals of masculine society. The hierarchy was less rigid than in mixed company, but still present. The most prominent men held court at particular tables, their opinions listened to with deference, their jokes laughed at even when not particularly amusing. Politics was discussed with a frankness impossible in drawing rooms where ladies might be present. I heard members of Parliament speak of their votes as though they were commodities to be sold to the highest bidder, which in many cases they were. I heard gentlemen debate whether it was more profitable to support the government or the opposition, with no particular reference to principle or policy beyond what might benefit themselves. The corruption was so pervasive that it was barely recognised as corruption. It was simply how things were done. A seat in Parliament could be purchased through a patron who controlled a pocket borough. An appointment to a sinecure could be secured through the proper connections and the proper inducements. Government contracts were awarded to those with friends in power, regardless of whether they could actually fulfil the contracts. I heard one gentleman, a member of Parliament, explain quite openly that he had voted for a bill he personally opposed because the minister had promised him a valuable appointment for his son. He saw nothing wrong in this. It was expected. It was how the system functioned. The idea that one might vote according to conviction rather than advantage was regarded as naive at best, foolish at worst. The wealth that supported the great houses of London came from many sources, though the sources were not often examined too closely. Some fortunes were old, derived from land that had been held for generations. Others were newer, built on trade, on banking, on government contracts during the wars with France. Some came from places that were rarely mentioned in drawing rooms: the plantations in the West Indies, the trading posts in India, the slave ships that carried their cargo across the Atlantic. I dined once at a house where the family fortune had been made in sugar. The owner's grandfather had established plantations in Jamaica worked by people held in bondage. That grandfather had returned to England, purchased an estate, built a great house, and established his family among the gentry. His grandson, my host, had never seen Jamaica, had no direct involvement in the management of the plantations. He simply collected the income they generated, an income that supported the house where I dined, the servants who attended us, the wine we drank, the fine food we consumed. The conversation that evening touched on many subjects: the weather, the theatre, politics, the state of the roads. It did not touch on the source of the wealth that made the dinner possible. That was understood to be in poor taste, a violation of the unspoken code that kept unpleasant realities at a safe distance. We ate sugared almonds for dessert, and no one thought to trace their sweetness to its bitter origin. This selective blindness was pervasive. The wealthy knew, in an abstract sense, that their comfort depended on systems of exploitation, but they did not know it in any immediate visceral way that would require them to act or feel or change. The distance was maintained through deliberate effort, through the careful architecture of daily life that placed unpleasant realities beyond sight and therefore beyond conscience. I do not exempt myself from this criticism. I dined at those tables. I wore clothes made by people whose wages were insufficient to support their families. I rode in carriages, whilst people walked through rain and mud. I attended churches and sang hymns about justice, whilst participating in a social order that denied justice daily to the majority of the population. I was complicit, as everyone who benefits from an unjust system is complicit, no matter how much we might tell ourselves otherwise. The fashions of the era were themselves revealing of the values that governed society. Women's dress in the later Georgian period favoured a silhouette that emphasised naturalness, the simple lines of classical antiquity. Muslin gowns that draped gracefully, minimal corseting, hair arranged in loose curls rather than the towering structures of earlier decades. This was meant to signal a return to nature, to simplicity, to virtue. Yet the simplicity was elaborate in its achievement and expensive in its maintenance. The muslins had to be of the finest quality, which meant they had to be imported from India. The simple draping required considerable skill to achieve. The loose curls required daily attention from a lady's maid. A wardrobe of simple muslin gowns cost as much as the elaborate silks they replaced, perhaps more, for fashion demanded constant renewal, and the muslins wore out more quickly than heavier fabrics. The gentleman's fashion moved toward greater sobriety during the period I am describing. The bright silks and elaborate embroideries of the mid-century gave way to darker colours, simpler lines, the emphasis on perfect tailoring rather than ornament. A gentleman's coat should fit so perfectly that he could barely raise his arms, and achieving that fit required a tailor of exceptional skill and multiple fittings. The simplicity was, once again, elaborate in its execution and expensive in its result. I knew a gentleman who spent £200 per year on his clothes, a sum that represented the entire annual income of a prosperous tradesman. He employed a tailor, a bootmaker, a shirtmaker, a hatter, all of whom maintained accounts that were settled quarterly, when the gentleman received the rents from his estate. His wardrobe contained perhaps 30 coats, 50 waistcoats, innumerable shirts and cravats and breeches. Yet he dressed, he claimed, with perfect simplicity, with none of the ostentation of his father's generation. The contradictions were everywhere, once one learned to see them. Simplicity that required great expense, naturalness that demanded constant artifice, virtue proclaimed whilst vice was practised. The wealthy of Georgian London lived within a web of such contradictions, and they navigated them with a skill born of long practice and absolute necessity. The private lives of the wealthy, behind the closed doors of their chambers, were as varied as humanity itself, but certain patterns emerged. Many marriages were arrangements of convenience rather than affection. alliances between families designed to consolidate property or advance social position. The husband and wife might live essentially separate lives within the same house, meeting primarily for formal dinners or public appearances. I knew one couple who maintained separate floors of their house. The husband occupied the ground floor and first floor, the wife the second floor and third. They met at dinner when they were both in London, which was not frequent, for he often stayed at his club, and she often visited friends in the country. They produced 2 children in the early years of their marriage, fulfilling the dynastic obligation, and thereafter lived as civil strangers. This was not considered unusual, or particularly unfortunate. Indeed, it was often spoken of as a sensible arrangement, allowing both parties the freedom to pursue their own interests, whilst maintaining the appearance of a respectable marriage. The husband had his mistresses, a series of women kept in houses in St John's Wood or Chelsea. The wife had her particular friendships with both men and women, relationships whose precise nature was not discussed, but generally understood. Other marriages were more successful in achieving some degree of genuine companionship or affection. I knew couples who seemed to actually enjoy each other's company, who conversed with animation, who appeared together at social events by choice rather than obligation. But even in these more harmonious marriages, the underlying structure remained. The husband controlled the property, made the decisions, lived a life largely separate from the domestic sphere that was considered the wife's domain. Women of the wealthy classes lived within constraints that were simultaneously rigid and invisible. They could not own property in their own names once married. They could not vote, could not enter the professions, could not move freely through the city without chaperones or escorts. Their primary purpose was understood to be the production of legitimate heirs and the management of the household. Yet within these constraints, some women found ways to exercise considerable power. A clever woman could manage her husband through apparent submission. A socially adept woman could shape opinion through her salon, determining which politicians or artists or writers would be patronized and which would be excluded. A wealthy widow, temporarily freed from marital constraint before remarrying, might briefly taste independence, though social pressure to remarry was intense. I knew a widow, Lady C, who had been left wealthy at the age of 35 when her husband died of an apoplexy. For 5 years, she managed her own affairs, travelled where she pleased, entertained whom she chose, and seemed genuinely content. But the pressure to remarry mounted. Her late husband's family wanted her to produce an heir. Her own family worried about the impropriety of her independence. Society whispered that she was becoming eccentric, which was a polite way of saying dangerous. She remarried eventually, to a gentleman considerably younger than herself, and her brief independence ended. Her property passed to her new husband's control. Her freedom to move and act and choose was once again constrained by the expectations of wifehood. She accepted this with apparent equanimity, for the alternative was social ostracism, and humans are social creatures who require connection even when it comes at great cost. The education of children in wealthy families was designed to perpetuate the system that sustained them. Boys were sent away to schools where they learned Latin and Greek, mathematics and history, but primarily they learned to be gentlemen. They learned the subtle gradations of rank and precedence. They learned how to dress, how to converse, how to comport themselves in society. They learned that they were different from and superior to those below them in the social hierarchy, a lesson taught not through explicit instruction but through the entire structure of their daily existence. Girls were educated at home by governesses, or at select schools where they learned accomplishments rather than scholarship. French and Italian, drawing and watercolours, needlework and music, dancing and deportment. They learned to manage servants, to plan menus, to dress appropriately for every occasion, to converse pleasantly without saying anything significant, to be ornamental rather than useful in any practical sense. I knew a young woman of considerable intelligence who desperately wanted to study mathematics and natural philosophy. She read what books she could obtain, taught herself what she could through reading. But there was no possibility of formal education in these subjects, no possibility of pursuing them seriously. She married, as was expected, and her intellectual interests were regarded as charming eccentricities to be indulged within limits. When she died young, of complications from childbirth, her books were sold and her papers destroyed. Nothing remained of her intellectual life except the memory of a few who had known her. The The waste was enormous. How many minds were constrained by the accident of being born female into the wealthy classes? How many potential poets or mathematicians or philosophers spent their lives instead planning dinner parties and managing servants? The society praised women who accepted these limitations with grace, and treated those who chafed against them as aberrations to be corrected or pitied. The relationship between the wealthy and their servants was perhaps the most intimate and yet the most distant of all the relationships that structured Georgian society. Servants were present in every aspect of daily life. They dressed their employers, served their meals, cleaned their chambers, attended to their most personal needs. Yet they were expected to be invisible, to perform their duties without intruding on their employer's consciousness. I spoke once with a housemaid named Elizabeth, who worked in a house in Portman Square. She rose at 5 each morning and worked until 11 or midnight. Her tasks included laying fires, carrying water, emptying chamber pots, sweeping, dusting, making beds, attending to the linen. She had 1 afternoon off per month. Her wages were £6 per year, plus her room in the attic and her meals in the servants' hall. She told me that the hardest part was not the physical labour, though that was hard enough, but the requirement to be invisible. She was expected to move through the house as though she did not exist, to be present when needed, and absent when not, to hear nothing and see nothing, and speak only when spoken to. If she encountered family members on the stairs, she was expected to turn and face the wall until they passed. If she was working in a room when they entered, she was expected to leave immediately and return later, no matter how inconvenient. She had been with the family for 7 years and could not recall a single conversation with her mistress beyond instructions about work. The mistress knew nothing about her life, her family, her thoughts or feelings or hopes. She was simply Elizabeth the housemaid, interchangeable with any other housemaid, valued only for her labour. This was typical. Servants were not regarded as fully human in the way that their employers were human. They were a class apart, necessary but not quite real, present but not quite there. The wealthy depended on them absolutely, but accorded them no status, no dignity beyond what their position demanded, no acknowledgement of their inner lives. Yet the servants saw everything. They knew which marriages were unhappy, which gentlemen were dissolute, which ladies took laudanum, which families were living beyond their means. They knew the secrets that the wealthy thought were hidden. The servants were present in every room, handling every intimate aspect of life. The invisibility their employers demanded worked both ways. The wealthy did not see their servants, and therefore believed their servants saw nothing. Some servants were treated more kindly than others. I knew families who genuinely cared for their long-serving retainers, who provided for them in old age, who regarded them as part of the extended family. But even in these cases, the fundamental inequality remained. Kindness was offered from above to below, charity from superior to inferior. The servant had no claim to consideration beyond what the employer chose to grant. The servant who became ill or elderly or simply worn out by labour had little recourse. There were no pensions except what an employer might provide from generosity. A servant dismissed without a character reference could find no further employment. The workhouse loomed as a final destination for those who could no longer work and had no family to care for them. I learned of a butler who had served one family for 40 years. He had managed the household with impeccable efficiency, had trained several generations of footmen, had overseen every aspect of domestic life. When he grew too old to perform his duties, he was retired with a small pension, enough to keep him from absolute want but not enough for comfort. He lived in a single room in a none too respectable neighbourhood, alone, forgotten by the family he had served with devotion. He died within 2 years, and no one from the family attended his final resting. This was the machinery that sustained the appearance of effortless grace in those Mayfair drawing rooms. Dozens of people working long hours in difficult conditions for wages that barely sustained them. Their labour rendered invisible by deliberate choice. Their humanity discounted in the calculus that valued refinement above justice. The city itself, beyond the fashionable squares and crescents, was a place of extraordinary contrast and complexity. One could walk from Mayfair to St. Giles in 15 minutes and pass from a world of wealth and cleanliness to a world of poverty so extreme it seemed impossible they existed in the same city, under the same government, breathing the same air. I walked through Seven Dials one afternoon, curious to see a part of London I had heard spoken of but never visited. The streets were narrow, the buildings leaning toward each other as though too weary to stand upright. Refuse lay in the gutters, and sometimes in the street itself. The air smelled of things I cannot adequately describe, a mixture of decay and humanity and despair. People lived in those buildings in conditions that defied belief. Entire families in single rooms, sometimes multiple families sharing a room. No clean water, no proper sanitation, no light or air beyond what came through windows often broken and stuffed with rags. Children played in the streets wearing rags, their faces marked by what want and neglect had written there. I saw an old woman sitting in a doorway. So still I thought at first she had already passed from this life. But her eyes moved, following me as I walked past. I gave her a sixpence and she took it without speaking, without gratitude or resentment, simply accepted it, as one accepts what chance brings. This was the foundation, I understood, upon which the wealth of London rested. These people worked when they could find work, in conditions and for wages that barely sustained life. They made the goods that the wealthy consumed. They cleaned the streets the wealthy drove through. They loaded and unloaded the ships that brought tea and spices and cotton and sugar. They were necessary, and they were invisible. And when they died, as they often did young, others came from the countryside to take their places. The wealthy knew about these places. They knew people lived in such conditions. But knowing in an abstract sense is different from knowing in a way that requires response. The distance was maintained through a combination of physical separation and moral philosophy that explained poverty as the inevitable result of vice or indolence, that understood the social hierarchy as natural and ordained, that saw charity as virtue but justice as dangerous radicalism. I attended a dinner party where the conversation touched briefly on the poor. A gentleman said that poverty was regrettable but unavoidable, that attempts to relieve it through public means only encouraged indolence and vice. Better to let nature take its course, he argued, and allow those who could not support themselves to suffer the natural consequences of their inadequacy. Others at the table nodded in agreement. A lady added that she gave to charity, to the deserving poor, those who attended church and kept themselves respectable despite their poverty. But the mass of the poor, those who drank and fought and lived in squalor, those were beyond help and perhaps beyond deserving it. The conversation moved on to other topics. No one questioned the fundamental assumption that poverty was an individual failing rather than a structural condition. No one suggested that the wealth being consumed in that dining room had any connection to the poverty in Seven Dials. The intellectual architecture that kept these realities separate was as solid as the stone walls that kept the poor out of Mayfair. Yet occasionally, the walls were breached. Crime brought the poor into contact with the wealthy, usually as perpetrators, sometimes as victims, always as reminders that the city was not as neatly divided as the wealthy preferred to believe. The streets were not entirely safe, even in fashionable neighbourhoods. Link boys who were hired to light one's way home might lead one into an ambush. Pickpockets worked the crowds at public executions and at Vauxhall Gardens. Burglars broke into houses despite locks and bars. I was once followed through Soho by two men who clearly intended robbery. I walked quickly toward a more populous street and they gave up the pursuit, but I felt for several blocks afterward the terror of understanding how thin the membrane was between safety and violence, between the protected and the predatory. The responses to crime revealed much about the values of Georgian society. The penalty for theft of goods worth more than a shilling was transportation or the final reckoning in public view. The gallows at Tyburn, later at Newgate, saw regular processions of the condemned, and these events drew crowds of thousands who gathered to watch justice administered in its most absolute form. I attended such an event once, though I took no pleasure in it, and went only because I felt I should understand this aspect of the society in which I lived. The crowd was enormous, filling the street, pressed against barriers, some people having paid for windows overlooking the scene. There was a festival atmosphere, vendors selling pies and gin, people laughing and shouting. The condemned were brought in carts, some weeping, others seemingly insensible through drink or despair, a few maintaining a defiant front that might have been courage or simply numbness. The procedure was swift and brutal. The crowd cheered or booed according to their assessment of the condemned. Then it was done, and the crowd dispersed, and the bodies were left hanging as both warning and spectacle. I felt ill walking home that day, not because I opposed punishment for crime, for I understood that society must have some means of maintaining order, but because the disproportion seemed so enormous. A young man hanged for stealing a handkerchief, a woman transported for taking bread she could not afford to purchase. The wealthy who stole through corrupt business practices or exploitation of workers faced no such penalties, for their theft was legal, sanctioned by the very structure of society. The law protected property more zealously than it protected persons. A gentleman who beat his wife faced no legal consequences. A gentleman who beat his servant faced only the mildest censure, and only if the beating was excessive by the standards of the day. But a servant who stole from the gentleman faced transportation or execution. The hierarchy was enforced through violence, legal and sanctioned, systematic and thorough. The years I am describing, the last decades of the 18th century and the first decades of the 19th, were a period of considerable political turmoil. The American colonies were lost. The French Revolution convulsed Europe and sent tremors through English society. The wars with France consumed enormous resources and brought profound changes. Yet for the wealthy of London, life continued with surprising continuity. The wars brought some disruption, certainly. Young men joined the military, though more often as officers in fashionable regiments than as common soldiers. Some were killed or wounded, and returned changed by what they had experienced. But for most of the wealthy, the wars were distant events that affected them primarily through taxes and through the opportunities for profit that war always brings to those positioned to take advantage. I knew a gentleman who made a considerable fortune supplying the army with uniforms and equipment. The quality of what he supplied was barely adequate. The prices he charged were extraordinary, and he faced no consequences because he had the proper connections and paid the proper bribes. Thousands of soldiers wore his badly made boots and slept under his thin blankets, whilst he added rooms to his country house and bought his son a commission in a regiment that never left England. The French Revolution was spoken of with horror in London drawing rooms. The execution of the French king and queen, the terror, the subsequent wars, all were presented as warnings of what happened when the natural order of society was disrupted. The wealthy drew closer together, defended their privileges more zealously, suppressed any hint of radical thought with increasing severity. Yet some recognized that change was necessary, that a society built on such extreme inequality could not continue indefinitely without catastrophic consequences. I heard William Wilberforce speak once about the abolition of the slave trade, and I was moved by his moral clarity and his persistence in the face of enormous opposition from those whose wealth depended on slavery's continuation. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 was a genuine moral achievement, though it came shamefully late and fell far short of full emancipation. Many of the same people who opposed abolition attended church every Sunday and spoke piously of Christian virtue. Their ability to separate their religious beliefs from their economic interests was remarkable and depressing, and entirely typical of the moral compartmentalization that characterized their lives. As I grew older and observed more, I began to understand that the wealth and refinement I had initially envied were built on foundations that could not be sustained indefinitely. The system required exploitation, required the invisibility of most of humanity, required an elaborate structure of self-deception and moral blindness. It was magnificent in its way, but it was also monstrous, and the magnificence and the monstrosity were inseparable. I remember walking through Mayfair one evening in 1815, after the final defeat of Napoleon, when peace had returned and society was celebrating. The houses were illuminated, windows blazing with candlelight, the sounds of music and laughter spilling into the street. I stood outside one such house and watched the shadows of dancers moving across the windows, and I thought about all that I had seen and learned. Would you have envied them still, knowing what you now know? Would you have wanted to trade places with those dancers, to wear their silk and jewels, to eat at their tables, to live in their great houses? The comfort was real, the beauty was real, the refinement was real, but so was the cost, paid by people whose names the wealthy never knew, whose lives the wealthy never considered, whose suffering made possible every elegant dinner and every graceful dance. I left London in 1819. There were personal reasons, matters of business and family, but there was also a weariness born of too many years observing a system I could neither change nor entirely extract myself from. I retired to a small estate in the West Country, far from the fashionable world, and lived there quietly for the next 2 decades. When I returned in 1843, much had changed, and much remained the same. The houses were still there, still magnificent, though many were now occupied by new families. The old names having faded or failed. The season continued, the marriage market operated, the servants rose before dawn and worked until midnight. The machinery of wealth continued to turn, consuming the lives and labour of the many to provide comfort for the few. But something had shifted. The certainty I remembered, the absolute confidence of the wealthy in their right to their position, had eroded slightly. The Reform Act of 1832 had begun, however inadequately, to address questions of representation. The new industrial wealth from the north was challenging the old landed wealth of the south. The city was changing, growing, becoming something new. I'm old now, too old to see how it will all resolve, but I have lived long enough to understand that nothing lasts, that every edifice of power eventually crumbles, that wealth provides no immunity from time. The great houses I knew in my youth are already passing into memory. The families are failing or changing. The certainties are becoming questions. I have written this account not to condemn, though perhaps condemnation is warranted, and not to excuse, though understanding requires some degree of empathy, even for those whose privilege we might question. I have written simply to record what was, to preserve in words what memory has preserved in images and impressions. The wealthy of Georgian London lived in a world of extraordinary beauty and equally extraordinary cruelty, often within the same moment, sometimes within the same room. They were not uniformly wicked, nor were they uniformly virtuous. They were human beings navigating a system they had inherited, making choices within constraints they rarely questioned, pursuing happiness and security through means that seemed natural to them because they knew no other way. But the system itself was profoundly unjust, and their participation in it, however unconscious, however inevitable given their circumstances, contributed to the suffering of countless others. The servants who worked themselves into early graves, the colonial subjects whose labour enriched the empire, the poor who died in the streets whilst the wealthy dined on 7 courses, the women whose minds were wasted on accomplishments instead of allowed to flourish in scholarship, the children who inherited both privilege and the moral blindness necessary to enjoy it without questioning its foundations. I think now of specific faces, specific moments. The housemaid Elizabeth turning to face the wall as her employers passed. Miss H, her face flushed with hope at that ball at Olmax, before she learned her worth in the marriage market. The old woman in 7 Dials, accepting my 6pence without expectation or surprise. The young man at White's, his face changing colour as he realised he had ruined himself at cards. The actress Miss S, smiling and singing whilst her health deteriorated from the demands of her profession. I think of the great houses themselves, those Palladian monuments to wealth and taste, and I understand now that they were prisons as much as palaces. The wealthy were constrained by their position no less than the poor were constrained by poverty. Different constraints, certainly far more comfortable, infinitely more pleasant, but constraints nonetheless. The endless performance of refinement, the constant vigilance required to maintain position, the suffocating expectations and rigid conventions, the loneliness of living amongst people who valued one for wealth or connections rather than for oneself. I attended a ball one night, late in my time in London, when I was no longer young and had seen enough to understand what I was seeing. I stood at the edge of the ballroom and watched the dancers moving through their figures, the candlelight catching on jewels and silk, the music rising and falling, the whole scene like something from a painting. And I saw both its beauty and its emptiness, its grace and its futility. These people were dancing toward their own extinction, though they did not know it. The world that had created them and sustained them was already changing, already moving toward forms they could not imagine and would not have welcomed had they known. The Industrial Revolution was transforming England. The cities were growing. New forms of wealth were emerging that would dwarf the old fortunes built on land and trade. The certainties of the 18th century were giving way to the uncertainties of the 19th. The great houses would remain, many of them, but they would become museums rather than homes, monuments to a vanished way of life. The titles would continue, but increasingly they would be held by people whose wealth came from industry or finance, rather than from inherited estates. The season would persist, but it would become a pale shadow of its former self, a ritual observed more from habit than from necessity. I have lived to see the beginning of this transformation, though not its completion. I have seen the confidence of the wealthy begin to erode, have heard doubt creep into voices that once spoke with absolute certainty about the natural order of things. I have seen some question what their grandparents never questioned, have seen some try, however inadequately, to address the injustices that sustained their comfort. Whether these changes will be sufficient, whether they will come soon enough, whether the transformation can be managed without the kind of violent upheaval that consumed France, I cannot say. I will not live to see the resolution, but I have hope, cautious and qualified, that the future will be different from the past, that the machinery of exploitation I witnessed will eventually be dismantled, that human dignity will someday be accorded to all humans rather than reserved for the privileged few. The London I knew in my youth exists now only in memory. The physical city remains, changed but recognizable. But the social world, that elaborate structure of rank and precedence, of drawing rooms and dinner parties, of seasons and salons, of servants and masters, that world is fading even as I write. The people who inhabited it are mostly gone now, their names carved on monuments in churches, their portraits hanging in country houses, their correspondence preserved in archives where scholars will someday read and try to understand what we were and how we lived. I hope they will be fair in their judgment. I hope they will recognize both the beauty we created and the cost at which we created it. I hope they will understand that we were products of our time as they are products of theirs, and that moral clarity is easier to achieve in retrospect than in the midst of life as it is lived. But I also hope they will not excuse what should not be excused. The suffering we caused was real. The exploitation we benefited from was real. The injustices we perpetuated were real. That we did not always see them clearly, that we sometimes acted from ignorance rather than malice, that we were trapped in systems larger than ourselves, none of this absolves us entirely. I remember a conversation I had with a clergyman late in my time in London. We were discussing the poor, and he said something that has stayed with me. He said that every society tells itself stories to justify the distribution of suffering, that the wealthy always find reasons why their wealth is deserved and the poverty of others is either inevitable or earned. He said that the test of a society is not whether it tells these stories, all societies do, but whether anyone listens with sufficient skepticism to question them. I did not question enough in my youth. I accepted too readily the explanations I was given, the justifications that made it possible to enjoy comfort whilst others suffered. I was not unique in this. Most people in every age accept the world they inherit and adapt themselves to its demands. Questioning requires courage and involves costs that many are not willing to pay. But some did question, some did resist, some did work within the limitations of their time and position to make things better. I knew people who genuinely cared for their servants, who paid fair wages and provided good conditions. I knew people who supported abolition despite the economic cost. I knew people who gave generously to charity and who treated the poor with respect and dignity. I knew people who questioned the marriage market and tried to give their daughters more choices than convention allowed. These people were a minority, and their efforts were insufficient to fundamentally transform the system. But they were not nothing. They represented the possibility of something better, the recognition that the way things were was not the way things had to be. They kept alive, in however limited a form, the idea that justice was possible and desirable, even when it conflicted with interest. I think of them now with gratitude and with sadness gratitude that they existed, sadness that there were so few of them, and that even they could accomplish so little against the enormous inertia of an unjust system. But they are part of the story too, part of what must be remembered along with the balls and dinners and elegant drawing rooms. The sun is setting now beyond my window. I'm writing this in my study in the countryside, far from London, in a house much smaller and simpler than the great houses I once visited. My hands are stiff with age and my eyes grow tired quickly. I do not know how much longer I will live, but I know it will not be long. The generation I belong to is passing, and soon there will be no one left who remembers Georgian London as I remember it, from within, as a participant and observer both. So I set these memories down, inadequate as they surely are, incomplete as any human record must be. I have tried to be honest, to record both what was beautiful and what was terrible, to show how they were intertwined and inseparable. I've tried to evoke not just the facts, but the feeling of that world, the texture of daily life, the weight of candle smoke in a crowded ballroom, the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones, the taste of claret and oysters, the sight of servants' faces caught for a moment in candlelight before they remembered to make themselves invisible again. If I have succeeded, you will understand something of how the wealthy truly lived in Georgian London. Not the myth of elegance and refinement that exists in popular imagination, nor the simple condemnation that sees only exploitation and hypocrisy. The truth, as always, is more complex than either fantasy or condemnation allows. They lived well and badly simultaneously. They created beauty and caused suffering with the same gestures. They were capable of genuine kindness and of profound cruelty, often within the same person, sometimes within the same hour. They were human, which is to say, they were capable of both transcendence and baseness, and they expressed both with equal facility. The world they built was magnificent and monstrous, beautiful and unjust, refined and brutal. It could not last, and it did not last, and perhaps that is the final truth to be drawn from all of this, that nothing built on such foundations can endure, that injustice contains the seeds of its own destruction, that time humbles every certainty and erodes every structure, no matter how solidly it seems to be built. I walked through Mayfair when I returned in 1843, and I saw ghosts everywhere. The houses were still there, solid stone and brick, but I saw them also as they had been on winter evenings, when every window blazed with candlelight and music spilled into the streets. I saw the carriages that no longer existed, heard voices that had been silent for decades, glimpsed faces that belonged to people long dead. Memory transforms everything it touches, makes the past more vivid than the present, more real than reality. The London I remember has been polished by time, its edges softened, its harshness muted, its beauty enhanced. I know this, and yet I cannot help but see it as I see it, cannot help but feel the loss of something that, for all its faults, possessed a coherence and certainty that the modern world seems to lack. This is the privilege of old age, and perhaps also its delusion, to believe that the past was better, that the world one knew in youth possessed qualities that have since been lost. Every generation believes this. Every generation is partly right and mostly wrong. The past was neither better nor worse than the present, simply different, and different in ways that are impossible to fully communicate to those who did not live through it. But I have tried. I have set down what I remember, what I witnessed, what I understood and failed to understand about that world and the people who inhabited it. If this account has value, it is as testimony, as one person's record of a time and place that can never be recovered except through such imperfect reconstructions. The candles are burning low now, and the light is fading from the sky. I will stop here, not because the story is complete. No story is ever complete, but because I have said what I can say, have recorded what memory has preserved. To those who may read this in years to come, I say, judge fairly if you judge at all. Remember that we were human as you are human, that we did the best we could with what we understood, that we loved and feared and hoped and failed as all humans do. Remember also that we were complicit in systems of great injustice, that our comfort was built on others' suffering, that our refinement masked profound moral failures. Remember both. Remember the candlelight and the darkness it created. Remember the music and the silence it required. Remember the silk and the hands that wove it. Remember the great houses and the small rooms in the attics where the servants slept. Remember it all, the whole truth in all its complexity and contradiction. This is how the wealthy lived in Georgian London. This is what I remember. This is what I witnessed. This is what was. The last light is gone from the sky now. The candle flame trembles and steadies, and soon it too will go out, as all flames do, as all light does, as all of us do eventually. But for this moment, it burns, illuminating these final words, this final memory, this final testimony to a world that was and is no more. And when this candle goes out, and when I go with it, the great houses will still stand for a time, solid and silent, monuments to what we built and what we were. But they too will pass, as everything passes, as even stone passes given enough time. And perhaps that is the truest thing to be said about it all, that permanence is an illusion, that everything fades, that dust settles even on gold, and that in the end, all that remains is the memory of those who witnessed, and the words of those who tried, however imperfectly, to tell the truth of what they saw. The candle flame trembles once more, and then is still,